Okay, that's not working. Here we go. Here we go.
The farmland in Sanford had not been producing well, and Bent found it almost impossible to obtain other work. He now planned to live with his first wife, Julia, and their extended family in Monroe, Utah, while Lorena and her children would live with her brother's family in a town about 100 miles away.
I grew up hearing my great grandmother tell these stories, and it was just heart wrenching. Yet she experienced it all.
After the Larsons spent days traveling alone through rock canyons, the starkly beautiful desert town of Moab, Utah, offered a welcome place to rest. During a previous stop, Bent and Lorena had learned that church leaders had issued a statement about plural marriage, but they had not heard anything more about it. In Moab, however, they met people who had gone to conference in Salt Lake City. While Lorena remained at the family's tent, Bent went to learn what he could about the manifesto.
Imagine if you were involved in a plural marriage when the manifesto came out, which is the situation that these people are in.
When Bent returned, he told Lorena that the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 had announced that the church had stopped performing plural marriages and intended to submit to the laws of the nation. Lorena could not believe what she was hearing. She had embraced plural marriage because she believed that it was God's will for her and the saints. The sacrifices she had made to practice the principle had brought her heartache and trial.
Imagine how difficult it was for a woman to practice this principle, believing it was from God. That's the only reason they would do it, and then to hear that the church had decided not to do it anymore. She did not know what to do.
But they had also challenged her to live on a higher plane, overcome her weaknesses, and love her neighbor. Why would God now ask the saints to turn away from the practice? Lorena looked to Bent for comfort, but instead of offering her words of reassurance, he turned and left the tent. Oh, yes, she thought, it is easier for you. You can go home to your other family and be happy with her. Well, I must be like Hagar, sent away.
How discouraging.
Darkness flooded Lorena's mind. If the Lord and the church authorities have gone back on that principle, she thought, there is nothing to any part of the gospel. She had believed that plural marriage was a doctrine as fixed and immovable as God himself.
Imagine how you would feel if you remember the church and you were involved in this practice, and then you find out that the church had just decided to go against it.
If that was not the case, why should she have faith in anything else? Lorena then thought of her family. What did the manifesto mean for her and her children? And what did it mean for the other women and children in the same situation? Could they still depend on their husbands and fathers for love and support?
I think it's pretty easy for you to see why it was such a dark time for Lorena. The manifesto had really changed their life and made it so that they couldn't live together anymore.
Or would they be cast adrift simply for having tried to serve the Lord and keep his commandments?
That's the bottom line. Would we be punished for being obedient?
Lorena collapsed into her bedding. The darkness around her became impenetrable, and she wished the earth would open up and swallow her and her children. Then suddenly, she felt a powerful presence in the tent. This is no more unreasonable than the requirement the Lord made of Abraham when he commanded him to offer up his son Isaac, a voice told Lorena. When the Lord sees that you are willing to obey in all things, the trial shall be removed.
Imagine how it would have felt to be in that tent with Lorena and heard that voice. She couldn't see anybody. She heard the voice clear as day.
A bright light enveloped Lorena's soul, and she felt peace and happiness. She understood that all would be well. A short time later, Bent returned to the tent. Lorena told him about the presence that had removed her anguish. I knew that I could say a word to comfort you. I knew I could not say a word to comfort you, Bent confessed, so I went to a patch of willows and asked the Lord to send a comforter.
What a remarkable spiritual experience for my third-grade grandmother.
President Grover Cleveland, favorable of Utah's bid for statehood, but the Republican Party gained control of the nation's government before he could raise enough support for it. The Democratic Party had been more lenient to the church for 40 years, but with the Republican Party taking control, the church needed friends in that party to achieve a change in government policy. The church was able to do that through one of its influential friends, Isaac Trumbo. After a church-wide fast, on December 23, 1889, and a couple of George Buchanan visits to the Washington, D.C., the brethren began to be optimistic that the political currents were changing in their behalf.
Imagine what it would have been like to be a member of the church this time. You've been commanded to practice polymerase, now they're saying not to practice it. The church doesn't receive statehood. It's a terrible, terrible time to be a member of the church.
Moses Thatcher of the 12 and B.H. Roberts of the 70 accepted nominations to the U.S. legislature from the same party. After being disciplined by the brethren for doing so without consultation, the church issued the political manifesto that proclaimed the church was politically neutral and that general authority should attend to their ecclesiastical duties and not run for national office. Both brethren seriously struggled with this. B.H. Roberts finally complied, but Elder Thatcher did not and was dropped from the 12 while maintaining his membership.
Of course, we don't have anything like this in the church today. Back then we did, and it was pretty serious business.
After hiding more than 2 years on the underground, Lorena Larson and her children again had a house of their own in Monroe, Utah, not far from where her husband, Bent, lived with his first wife, Julia. But even though Monroe wasn't Lorena's hometown, she did not always feel welcome there. Throughout the church,
even though Monroe was Lorena's hometown.
Yeah. Throughout the church, many plural families continued to live as they always had, confident they were doing God's will. Some church members in Monroe, however, believed it was sinful for a man to continue having children with his plural wives.
Wow, imagine how difficult that would be.
When it became clear that Lorena was expecting another baby, some of her neighbors and family members began to openly scorn her. Bent's mother feared that Lorena would get her son thrown back in jail. Lorena's sister said that a pregnant plural wife was no better than someone who had committed adultery.
That was Lorena's sister that said that. So receiving persecution from members, but also from family.
And one day, Lorena's own mother, who was also the Ward Relief Society president, came to her home and chided her for continuing to have children with Bent.
So the persecution is coming from outside the family, within the family, from other members of the ward. It was a terrible time.
That evening, after Bent chopped some wood for her and the children, Lorena told him what her mother had said.
Imagine your mother being the Relief Society president, chiding you for pregnancy before marriage.
But rather than sympathize with Lorena, Bent told her that he agreed with his mother-in-law.
How do you like that?
He had been talking the matter over with friends, and they concluded that a man with plural wives had no choice but to stay with his first wife and let the others go.
Wow. Can you imagine?
He and Lorena would remain sealed, but they would have to wait until the next life to be together again.
So he's basically telling her that she's going to be a widow for the rest of her life.
Lorena could hardly speak. Since the manifesto, Bent had told her again and again that he would never abandon her. Now he was going to be leaving her and her children on their own, and only weeks before she was due to give birth. The couple talked all through the night. As Lorena cried, Bent told her that tears could not change the reality of their situation.
Wow.
If I didn't believe you thought you were doing God's service, Lorena told Bent, I could never forgive you. After Bent was gone, Lorena prayed for strength and wisdom. Just as the sun was beginning to show over the mountains, she found Bent working in a stable behind Julia's house and told him he had to stand by her at least until their baby was born. After that, she said, he could go wherever he wanted. God was now her only friend, and she would turn to him for help.
Wow.
Lorena gave birth to a daughter 2 weeks later.
Can you imagine how difficult this would have been?
When the baby was 5 days old, Lorena had a dream about dying and woke up in a panic. Could she trust Bent to care for their children if she died? He had provided for her and the children throughout her pregnancy, as promised. But he rarely interacted with the children, and when he did, his quick, anxious visits often left them feeling like a stranger had dropped by for the evening. When Lorena told Bent about her premonition, he dismissed it. It's only a dream, he said. Still feeling uneasy, she prayed often over the next month, promising the Lord that she would endure her trials and hardships patiently and do all she could to further his work, including temple work. 5 weeks after Lorena's dream, a marshal arrested her and Bent for unlawful cohabitation. The court released them on bond with the expectation that Lorena would testify in court against Bent when his trial came up later that year.
How much more can you ask of these saints?
The arrest and the contempt Lorena felt from family and friends were too great for her to bear. Unsure what to do, she unburdened her soul to Apostle Anton Lund, the president of the Manti Temple. Anton wept as he listened to her story. Walk straight ahead amid the sneers and jeers of everybody, he counseled her. You are all right. Following the apostles' counsel, Lorena moved straight ahead with her life.
Wow.
Her alarming dream and the prayers that followed helped her become more patient, more able to endure her trials, and more thankful to the Lord for her life. Bent also saw that his neglect caused Lorena intense suffering, and he and Lorena ultimately decided to continue with their life together, though it never would be easy. That September, Bent pleaded guilty to the charge of unlawful cohabitation, and a judge sentenced him to serve 1 month in jail.
The real question here, I guess, is could I have been a member of the church back then? Could I have listed these trials? I don't know that I could have. Lorena suffered this much and more. I'm only just briefly covering what she suffered, and Ben did as well.
The punishment was not as severe as it had been years before, when Bent had served 6 months on a similar charge. In fact, since the manifesto, sentences for unlawful cohabitation were often much shorter than before. But it was a reminder that if Lorena and Bent continued their relationship, the consequences could be hard to bear. Still, it was a risk the couple was now willing to take.
Wow. At least they could do it together and suffer alone.
The end of an era. A few people still chose to end their plural marriages, but most people sought to comply with the manifesto in less drastic ways. Some men continued as best they could to support their plural families, financially and emotionally, without living with them. Others continued to live with their families as if nothing had changed, even though doing so could subject them to prosecution and imprisonment.
Wow.
In early September, Joseph F. Smith learned of a newspaper report announcing that President Harrison had granted him amnesty. He did not want to celebrate or go out in public, however, until he had the documents in hand. I have been so long submerged under the flood of surging events, he wrote in a letter to a friend. If I get freedom in any form, I shall be like one raised from the dead or born again, with new experiences to get and everything to learn anew. The amnesty letter arrived a short time later, but he also knew that such a pardon might not stop the government from bringing new charges against men who continued to live with wives they had married long ago. To be safe, he chose to stay nights at the first presidency's office while still teaching his children and supporting his large family. He and his 5 wives also continued to have more children.
This is amazing. So the reason I chose these 2 examples is you have one example who's a president, member of the first presidency. Another example, my great grandmother, who's just a nobody in the church, no name association, etc. So that it affected everybody. The wide range of people were affected by this cry against foreign marriage.
Some still struggle. That spring, 19-year-old John Widtsoe celebrated his graduation from Brigham Young College in Logan. At the commencement ceremony, he received special recognition for his excellence in rhetoric, German, chemistry, algebra, and geometry. During his time at the college, John was thrilled when he uncovered some new piece of knowledge. The college was still new, and it did not have many books in its library or much equipment in its laboratory. Nor did its faculty have advanced academic degrees, though the teachers were excellent instructors who knew how to simplify a subject and teach it to their students. The college principal, Joseph Tanner, was a former pupil of Carl Mazer, the famed principal of Brigham Young Academy in Provo, who now served as superintendent of more than 3 dozen church schools. A former missionary to Europe and the Middle East, Joseph also taught religion classes, instructing John and his fellow students in the plan of salvation and the restoration of the gospel. Theology became one of John's favorite subjects. It shaped his character and outlook on life and made him more sensitive to the differences between right and wrong. Around the time of graduation, Joseph invited John to join him and a group of young Latter-day Saint scholars enrolling that summer at Harvard University, the oldest and most respected university in the United States. Joseph wanted the scholars to gain a first-class education, which they could then use to improve the quality of instruction in Utah schools. Harvard was just the kind of place John's mother, Anna, had always wanted him to attend, and she supported his decision to go there, confident he would excel in his studies. Anna wrote frequently to John. You will probably have many little difficulties and will probably face small disappointments at first, she told him in one letter, but they can all be of great use to you in the future. God is with you, and he will bless you. He will bless you double what you dare imagine or pray for, she promised.
My own son, Nathan, applied for and got accepted to Harvard and will attend there this fall. This story is very difficult for me because it shows what happened to John Widtsoe, who became one of the apostles of the Lord. It's a very difficult place to go, but my son's going there and I'm excited for him.
However, after going off to Harvard, Anna Widtsoe became concerned for her son John. He had recently written about his struggle to believe some aspects of the gospel. At Harvard, he had learned a great many things from his professors, but their lectures had also led him to question his faith. His doubts cut him to the bone. Some days he denied God's existence. Other days he affirmed it. Anna prayed daily for her son, deeply distressed by his doubts. But she knew he had to gain his own witness of the gospel.
And that is the bottom line. Everybody has to receive their own witness of the gospel. John Winslow, my son, it doesn't matter. Harvard just made him think about it more.
For decades, the Saints in Utah had voted for local candidates in the People's Party, a political party composed mainly of church members.
This is a difficult time in the church's history, and I hope you realize how great we have it today. This next piece will really show that clearly to you.
But in 1891, church leaders disbanded the People's Party and encouraged the Saints to join either the Democrats or the Republicans, the two parties that dominated United States politics. These leaders hoped more political diversity among the Saints might increase their influence in local elections and in Washington, D.C.
Of course, that's the big picture seen by the leaders of the church. But the members of the church had been so faithful to the People's Party, now felt abandoned by that party and didn't know which party to join.
Creating unity amongst disunity. In St. George, as elsewhere, most saints believed they should join the Democratic Party, since the Republican Party had typically led anti-polygamy efforts against the church. In many communities, the prevailing attitude was that a good Latter-day Saint could never be a Republican.
Boy, that's changed, hasn't it?
Wilford Woodruff and other church leaders wanted to challenge this view, especially since the United States was being governed at the time by a Republican administration. They also believed diversity would help the church achieve such goals as Utah statehood and general amnesty for saints who had entered into plural marriages before the manifesto. But now, for the first time, saints were caught up in heated battles with one another over differing political views. The conflict troubled Wilford Woodruff, and he had urged the saints at the April 1892 General Conference to stop their bickering.
Oh, brother, sounds like a father, doesn't it?
On January 5, 1893, Joseph Dean learned that the United States President, Benjamin Harrison, had signed a general amnesty proclamation extending forgiveness to saints who had practiced plural marriage but had stopped cohabiting after the manifesto. For Joseph, the amnesty proclamation had little impact since he had not abandoned his plural family after the manifesto.
Oh, so difficult. So difficult.
The Salt Lake Temple. Funds for construction were exhausted, and some people doubted the church had the resources to finish the temple in the 6 months before the dedication. On October 10th, the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 met with other church leaders, including stake presidents and bishops, in the large, partially finished assembly room on the top floor of the temple. The purpose of the meeting was to recruit local leaders to help raise funds for the temple.
Oh, shoot. Well, here we go.
In an endowment room in the temple's basement, artists were painting beautiful murals representing the Garden of Eden, complete with waterfalls, grassy meadows, and rolling hills. A stairwell from this room led to another endowment room, where additional murals of deserts, jagged cliffs, wild animals, and dark clouds portrayed life after the fall. Before beginning the murals, most of the artists at work had been set apart by the First Presidency and received world-class training from art instructors in Paris. Saints encouraged to fast, or they were encouraged to fast, pray, and get their lives in order in preparation for the spiritual outpouring of the dedication. Money sent to the first presidency to help finish the edifice. Men and women worked tirelessly for weeks preceding the dedication so that everything could be in order. The days leading up to the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple were full of energy and commotion. Work on the temple was still in progress on the day before the doors were scheduled to open. Now tens of thousands of saints were planning to come to Salt Lake City that spring to see the house of the Lord with their own eyes. On April 6, 1893, dedicatory ceremonies commenced. President Woodruff saw in the events of the day the fulfillment of a prophetic dream. He told the saints that many years before, in a nocturnal visitation, Brigham Young had given him the keys of the temple and had told him to dedicate it to the Lord. In his opening remarks, President Woodruff prophesied that from that time the power of Satan would be broken and his power over the saints diminished, and there would be an increased interest in the gospel message.
We have seen the fulfillment of all three of those promises.
For over 30 minutes, Wilford offered thanks and gave praise to God. He presented the building to the Lord, asking him to watch over and protect it. He prayed for the priesthood quorums, the Relief Society, the missionaries, and the youth and children of the church. And he asked that all people might have their hearts softened and be free to accept the restored gospel. He prayed for the rulers of nations and for the poor, afflicted, and oppressed. Before closing, he asked the Lord to fortify the faith of the saints. Strengthen us by the memories of the glorious deliverances of the past, by the remembrance of the sacred covenants that thou hast made with us, he prayed, so that when evil overshadows us, when trouble encompasses us, when we pass through the valley of humiliation, we may not falter, may not doubt, but in the strength of thy holy name may accomplish all thy righteous purposes. 2 dedication sessions were held each day until every living worthy member could attend. Great spiritual manifestations during the dedication, with some seeing past presidents of the church, etc. Other inspired changes. President Woodruff, himself a visionary man and a proponent of work for the dead, in 1894 received a revelation to discontinue the practice of adoption, being sealed to prominent general authorities, which greatly accelerated family history work. In order for Utah to obtain statehood, the government had to be convinced of two critical items. Polygamy really had been abolished, and there would be a separation of church and state. Because the church had sponsored the People's Party, and it had been abolished, and the two-party system adopted, Republicans and Democrats, with stake presidents and encouraging participation in both parties. This was difficult, however, because most members favored the Democratic Party, since the Republican Party had demoralized the saints over plural marriage. Despite all of this, on January 4th, 1896, Utah finally became a state.
Wow.
A new direction. In December of 1896, fast and testimony meeting changed from the first Thursday to the first Sunday of the month. Missionary work was greatly expanded among the Polynesian people. The practice of migrating to Utah gradually died down, and members from other countries began to migrate to other western states and Canada. 50th anniversary of our arrival to Salt Lake Valley was celebrated on July 24th, 1897. The practice of rebaptism for special purposes was discontinued in October conference, 1897. President Woodruff died in his 91st year, September 2nd, 1898, while on vacation to California.
My friends, I don't think we'll ever understand how difficult it was to be a member of the church in the 19th century, but it was, and they survived it, and now have the blessings because of it. I'm so grateful for the willingness of these members of the church to suffer during this time for the many different things that they were asked to do, whether it was building the temple, ceasing the practice of plural marriage, or whatever it was. They're willing to do it, and that's the great blessings we have today. See that in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
That was interesting. When we lived in the Bay Area. My father was in the stake presidency. My mother was the most fantastic cook. So all the general authorities that came would come to our home for dinner. And John A. Woodsoe was coming. My mother would just be beside herself. You heard the word of Woodsoe?
Yeah.
That you're not supposed to eat chocolate or whatever. Well, it was more his wife than him. And so the stake president said, well, I better not fix anything chocolate. And he said, no,